16 bombers launch off a Navy carrier with fuel for one direction only, forward. April 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, and every crew knows there's no runway waiting for them. This is the Doolittle Raid, America's answer to a humiliation it could not let stand. After Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt demanded a way to strike the Japanese home islands directly. No Navy bomber had the range, so planners turned to an unlikely aircraft, the Army's B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was built for land runways, never meant to launch from a pitching carrier deck. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a famed air racer and engineer, was chosen to lead the impossible mission. Crews trained in secret at Eglin Field, Florida, practicing takeoffs in under 500 feet. Engineers stripped the bombers down, removing guns and armor to save every pound of weight. Extra fuel tanks were crammed into the fuselage, turning every spare inch into a gas can. Even with modifications, the math barely worked Tokyo, then somewhere in China, running on fumes. There was no plan to land the bombers safely, only to reach friendly territory and abandon them. 16 aircraft, 5 men each, loaded aboard the USS Hornet in San Francisco Bay. Most of the crew had never even seen a carrier deck before that morning in April. The plan called for launching 600 miles from Japan, close enough to reach China after. Then, on April 18th, a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force far earlier than planned. The task force commander made an immediate decision: launch now or risk losing the entire fleet. That decision meant taking off 200 miles farther from Japan than any plan allowed. Every crew now knew their fuel margin, already thin, had just vanished before they even lifted off. Doolittle's own aircraft was first, roaring down a deck far shorter than anything he'd trained on. One by one, all 16 bombers cleared the deck, none of them ever designed to return to it. Ahead lay 6 hours of open ocean before they would even reach the Japanese coastline. They flew so low over the waves that fuel efficiency mattered more than avoiding enemy radar. Each pilot now faced the same silent arithmetic: enough fuel to attack, but not to survive the return. At 250 miles per hour and just 200 feet above the water, the formation pressed on alone. Each bomber flew its own separate course, spaced apart, trusting navigation instead of formation flying. Navigators relied on dead reckoning, compass headings, and stopwatches, with no radio beacons to guide them. By early afternoon, the coastline of Japan finally appeared through the haze ahead of them. Doolittle's plane crossed inland first, climbing just enough to identify targets over Tokyo itself. Remarkably, Japanese air defenses were not on high alert, despite the earlier sighting of the fleet. Some Japanese observers mistook the incoming bombers for their own aircraft returning from drills. Doolittle's crew released their bombs over industrial and military targets in the heart of Tokyo. One by one, the other 15 bombers reached their own targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, and beyond. The physical damage was modest, but the psychological shock to Japan's home front was immense. For the first time, the Japanese public understood their home islands were not beyond enemy reach. With their bombs gone, every crew now turned entirely to the question of survival. The extra 200 miles from the early launch had already eaten deep into their fuel reserves. China lay hundreds of miles away, and darkness and a coming storm were closing in fast. Strong tailwinds, unforecast and unexpected, gave several crews just enough extra range to survive. Still, no crew had enough fuel to reach the airfields in China that had been planned. Worse, those Chinese airfields hadn't received word the raid was even happening that night. A communications failure meant no ground crews were waiting, no lights marking any runway below. One by one, engines began sputtering as fuel gauges dropped toward empty over hostile terrain. Doolittle himself gave the order. Crews would bail out into the night rather than crash-land blind. 15 of the 16 crews bailaid out or crash-landed somewhere across the Chinese countryside that night. One crew, low on fuel and desperate, instead diverted north into Soviet territory near Vladivostok. The Soviet Union, officially neutral against Japan at the time, interned that crew for over a year. Every single bomber was lost that night, exactly as the mission's planners had grimly expected. 16 crews were now scattered across a war zone, most with no idea where they had landed. Some men landed in trees, others in flooded rice paddies, injured but alive in the darkness. This region of China was contested ground, patrolled by Japanese forces hunting for downed American airmen. Chinese villagers and nationalist soldiers took enormous risks sheltering the stranded American flyers they found. Over the following weeks, local networks passed crews hand to hand toward safety further inland. Of the 80 men who launched that day, 69 eventually reached safety through China's interior. 3 men died that night, either from bailout injuries, drowning, or crash landings in the dark. 8 more airmen were captured by Japanese forces before they could reach friendly Chinese lines. Those captured men faced a military tribunal that violated basic protections owed to prisoners of war. 3 of the 8 captured airmen were executed months later, a fact the United States would not learn immediately. A 4th captured airman died in custody, worn down by disease and years of harsh imprisonment. The remaining 4 survived brutal captivity and were freed only after Japan's surrender in 1945. News of the Tokyo raid detonated in American newspapers long before the crew's fates were even known. For a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, the raid delivered a badly needed morale boost. When reporters asked where the bombers had launched from, President Roosevelt gave a deliberately mysterious answer. He credited the mythical Himalayan land from a popular novel, keeping the Hornets' role secret. In Tokyo, the reaction was very different: shock, then swift retaliation against those who had helped. Japanese forces launched a punitive campaign through the Chinese provinces that had sheltered the American crews. Historians estimate this campaign cost as many as 250,000 Chinese civilian lives. It stands as one of the war's most devastating and least remembered consequences of a single raid. Back in Washington, military planners studied the raid's numbers with a colder, more analytical eye. 16 bombers lost $16 million in aircraft for damage that barely dented Japanese industry. By pure military accounting, the mission looked like a costly gesture rather than a strategic victory. But one Japanese decision, made almost immediately, revealed the raid's true and lasting impact. Japan's high command decided its home islands could never again be left undefended like this. Admiral Yamamoto had long argued Japan needed to destroy America's carriers before they struck again. The Doolittle Raid gave Yamamoto's argument sudden, undeniable urgency inside Japan's naval command. Yamamoto pushed forward a plan already forming: draw the American fleet into one decisive battle. The target he chose was a small atoll far out in the central Pacific, Midway. Yamamoto believed capturing Midway would force America's remaining carriers into a battle Japan could win. But American codebreakers had already been reading fragments of Japan's naval communications for months. Station Hypo in Hawaii pieced together enough of the plan to know an attack was coming. They didn't know the target's name for certain, so they set a clever trap of their own. Midway's garrison sent a fake message claiming its freshwater plant had broken down. Japanese radio traffic soon repeated that exact detail, confirming Midway as the true target. Admiral Nimitz now knew where and roughly when Japan's carriers would strike next. He positioned 3 of America's remaining carriers in ambush, waiting northeast of the atoll. In June 1942, barely 6 weeks after the Tokyo raid, the 2 fleets finally collided. American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers mid-refueling, decks packed with fuel, bombs, and aircraft. Within minutes, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning, their air power effectively wiped out. Midway became the turning point historians now trace directly back to that April morning over Tokyo. A raid meant to boost morale had indirectly reshaped the entire course of the Pacific War. None of the 80 Doolittle raiders knew that day they had helped set this trap. Jimmy Doolittle himself believed the mission had been a failure, expecting a court-martial upon return. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and an immediate promotion to Brigadier General. The raid's true legacy wasn't the bombs dropped, but the fleet it lured to Midway. A mission built on numbers that never balanced still tipped the scales of the entire war. To understand why, we have to look closer at what happened after the crews scattered. That April morning, 16 crews accepted a mission built on a fuel margin that was never going to close. Their sacrifice bought no ground and little damage, yet it quietly set the stage for Midway. It's a reminder that the true cost of war is rarely measured, only in bombs dropped or ground gained. If this forgotten arithmetic of war surprised you, subscribe to Colonel Mittens for more true stories from history's front lines.